Give me a second here. Got to have some more of this. Ooh, stock cold brew, not too sweet coffee. Okay, so, stock is S-T-O-K, by the way. I really like... So I need to get into, because this is... cold brew coffee, when you're not making it yourself, is an expensive habit. Let's be clear about that. And the company that seems to be in most of the stores in New England is called Stock, S-T-O-K. I'm not here to tell you about cold brew coffee. We're going to do a book review here. But regardless, they do make a very unique espresso that has where they inject in extra protein and everything. I'd probably never stop buying that, just because what a great combination. It's cold brew, espresso, and it has extra protein in it. It has like an extra 10 grams of protein, per serving. I am all over that. But eventually I got to start making my own cold brew. I'll tell you what, if anybody listening to this has like a great guide or tip or, tips and, equipment that they use, whatever that they love for making cold brew, you let me know, because I need to get into this to do it. But boy, I love my coffee. Anyway, delicious. So, all right. The Golden Stallion, the man of tomorrow, Savzu, the rated R radio star, here, sadly alone right now. Well, not sadly. I love being in the BDSM studio here. And, there's really not room for more people yet. But maybe we'll get to that in the future. So, anyway, yeah. So I teased last week, maybe it was, or no. Actually, it was on Sunday. Is when I did the review of the Duke Xbox controller from Hyperkin. I teased that I would talk about. There was a couple books that I was going to do reviews for. One of them was Bloodlines of the Gods, Bloodline of the Gods by Nick Redfern, and the other is by Carlo Rovelli, which is The Order of Time. Which is a book that both Ellen and I have been enjoying. And actually, when Ellen was on the most recent Sovryn Tech Prime episode, that being episode 277, we got into a conversation, herself, me, and the lovely and hyper-intelligent Dr. Stephanie Murphy, the boss. Woo! We got into a conversation about ancient civilizations, lost civilizations, prehistoric, advanced, perhaps even industrial civilizations. We got into that whole conversation there. Now, a couple things. I'm going to make one correction. First off, the story about Joe Shoemaker, was not from James Gleek's Chaos, though that's a great book that I should do a review on as well. It was actually from another book. I think the name of the book was it was a book that I had read recently. There's not an audiobook available of it. But it was a book that had to do with, it's similar, in some ways similar to Bloodline of the Gods. And it's by a guy named Ed Melkowski, which is not Markowski, Ed Melkowski, called Ancient Egypt 39,000 BCE, The History, Technology, and Philosophy of Civilization X. Now, it's a great book. I don't think, I get feedback from a lot of Sovryn Tech listeners where they say, I just love your show and I don't agree with everything. I don't agree with you 100% on everything. But I love your show and I'd be scared if I did agree 100% with anyone on anything. That is such the right attitude, because that points, of course, to your individuality. I love hearing that. I take no offense to the fact that most people, if anyone, agrees with me 100% on things. Even Stephanie and I don't agree 100% on things. I imagine there's points where, Ellen doesn't agree 100% with me on everything and whoever else. So, all of that's great, and I like getting differing perspectives and ideas and thoughts and theories and what makes conversations between myself and say those ladies in particular always, so fascinating is that we get to bring our different angles to the table. But anyway, any of these books that I read, I don't agree with 100%. Okay. I'll say though, that book, Ancient Egypt, 39,000 BCE, which I should do a book review of as well, gets pretty close to the mark. And the reason I say that is because he doesn't go the direction that is going to be explored in the book we're about to review, which is Bloodline of the Gods. He steers clear of the idea of aliens and just says, no, maybe there's what this could be called Civilization X. Now, I'd really like to appropriate that term of Civilization X to be the standard by which I describe whenever I'm talking about a prehistoric advanced civilization, like maybe, a civilization that got to the industrial level, or somewhere within the 20th century. Hell, maybe it got to technological abilities from before the from after the 21st century, like technological abilities we don't even have right now. Maybe that happened. The case I used to bring up, so when I'm referencing like an ancient civilization, I'm going to try and use the term Civilization X from now on. I'm probably still going to have to caveat it talking about, perhaps ancient, advanced, or industrial civilizations, but I'd like to use the term Civilization X going forward. Okay, and I will use that term. Now, when I say Civilization X, I am not saying that there were aliens. I'm saying there was a ancient human civilization. Or at least an ancient Earth civilization of some kind that, because maybe it wasn't exactly Homo sapiens sapiens or something like that, which we'll describe a little bit when we review Bloodline of the Gods here. But I'm going to use that term to reference that. So when you hear the term Civilization X, that's what I'm talking about, is a prehistoric, as in before the Wall of History, before the Sumerians, or even before Göbekli Tepe, a civilization that reached an incredible point of advancement, or an interesting point of advancement that we never expected. Atlantis, right? If it's real, could be called a Civilization X. Plato's description of Atlantis isn't as far out as some people theorize, where actually Atlantis had nuclear power and all this stuff. Plato just described more or less a very beautiful, very Greek civilization when he talked about Atlantis, more or less, but other people go much further. But you could, I think it's still kind of safe to, that you could make a claim that potentially Atlantis was a Civilization X. Anyway, links will be in the show notes for the Ancient Egypt book, 39,000 BC by Ed Malkowski that I mentioned, and also links for the book that we're actually reviewing, which is Bloodline of the Gods. But these books, those two books I just named, are the outcropping of a very similar phenomenon that I think is largely a good thing. Okay. Now, like I said, I don't like the idea that, and Bloodline of the Gods goes right into, Nick Redfern, okay, the guy that wrote the book, Bloodline of the Gods, which came out in August of 2015. So it's got some years on it. He is one of the more popular figures or one of the more regular figures on the History Channel, quote-unquote, documentary, I put quote-unquote, documentary series, Ancient Aliens. Now, I think Ancient Aliens, which is in its 13th season, is very worthwhile to watch, okay? There's interesting things. There are tidbits of fact that I think you get absolutely nowhere else that are, they're oddities and they're intriguing and they're worth exploring more. However, their consistent answer or more or less consistent answer, I don't think it was until like the 10th or 11th season where they finally said, was this aliens? And then finally, for the first time, the narrator answered with a no. And it was great. It was like, whoa, wait, they're just dying to do that at some point, I'm sure. It's amazing that the show's been going 13 years. Anyway, but, they have the problem of where they just try to explain all of these historical oddities and mysteries away with the idea, well, there were extraterrestrials that came to the Earth a long time ago, and it's them. They did it, or they inspired the humans to do it, or something like that. I consider that answer to be invalid. Like, we talked about this in episode 277. Ellen brought up great points as to why that probably didn't happen. I did as well. Stephanie, we all kind of made the case. I think you cheapen things and you ruin things when you bring up, the possibility of aliens when it could just be ancient humans. There's really no reason that it couldn't be. Okay. So that's my big problem with the show, but it's still exploring things that really no other documentary series, quote unquote documentary series, or that many other people wouldn't really take the time to get into. Okay, so Nick Redfern is from that, and from that lineage. And Ancient Aliens itself is also kind of a byproduct of what these kinds of books, like Ancient Egypt 39,000 BC and Bloodline of the Gods, come from, where they are, there's not a whole, there's some new stuff in it, but they are really an amalgamation. These kinds of books, Bloodline of the Gods included, is an amalgamation of a lot of other research done by people that get called ancient astronaut theorists or ancient alien theorists. Your Zachariah Sitchins, your Eric von Danikins, your Immanuel Velikovsky's, or well, maybe Velikovsky not so much, but these kinds of characters. Okay, Philip Coppens, even though he's not so much into, the late Philip Coppens, he wasn't so much into Ancient Aliens, or David Hatcher Childress and some of these other guys. Okay, is it William Brambley, The Gods of Eden, that wrote that? He was another big character in all of this. So it's in many ways, both of these books, and Bloodline of the Gods especially, because it borrows a lot from Sitchin, and it talks about Sitchin, at length. Are amalgamations of all these different ideas, from like Graham Hancock, right? Robert Bauval, not Duvall, not the actor, but Robert Bauval, the Egyptologist, and so on. And it takes a lot of their ideas and puts them all together. Now, I think that this kind of thing is actually pretty great, okay, especially in book form, because when it becomes a compilation of all these different ideas, these guys, they couldn't communicate with each other. They were doing all of this research on these historical oddities and mysteries, for decades, and you didn't have email, you didn't have the internet. I guess you could pick up the phone, but long distance was a thing, and it was expensive, and usually they're already putting their, whatever money they had on the line to even do this research. They couldn't communicate much with each other. So they're writing these books very independently. They're all working very independently, as to where now with, in the quote unquote information age, now, you can get these compilation books where they can take all of the interesting tidbits from each of these, ancient astronaut theorists and whatever else, and they can put them all together and then come out, more or less come up with like a grand unified theory of their own. Now, again, like I said, I don't agree 100% with any of these guys, any of them. In the case of Nick Redfern, I sure as fuck don't agree with him about it being aliens. In the case of, Ed Melkowski that I mentioned, I have some issues there, but that's for when we're reviewing that book. Okay. I don't agree with anybody 100%. Not in Sitchin. And I knew Sitchin. Okay. And I don't agree with him 100%. He was a friend. You got to understand. I considered him a friend. All right. I got invited to his funeral. That's all right. That's the relationship. And, this, of course, that was back in 2010. I didn't get to make it, but regardless, this, I'm just saying, I can be close to these guys even, and I don't agree with them. And that's okay. They don't mind. They know I don't, and it's all right. So anyway, I say a lot of this to make it incredibly clear, okay, that I am not espousing what Ancient Aliens talks about. I am not, the show. I am not espousing the ancient astronaut theory or the ancient alien theory, whatever you want to call it. I am not espousing the idea that aliens have ever been to Earth, because I don't think they've ever been to Earth. I will proudly espouse that humans deserve a lot more credit than they've been given, and that they are still being given, especially by people in the libertarian community who think that everybody before the 20th century was an idiot. Okay. IQ is such bullshit. Anyway, I think that there were, you had Civilization X. I think that there were ancient humans that did remarkable things. Okay. That I espouse. Humans, not aliens, just humans. All right. Or something along those lines, that originated on Earth was on Earth. Now, before we start getting into Nick Redfern stuff, I want to bring up, look, I've been espousing this idea that I just described for a long time on Sovryn Tech. A long time, okay? And a lot of people ask me, well, where's the evidence? Well, in episode 277 of Sovryn Tech, we talked about how, at the University of Rochester, in this, theoretical paper, out of the International Journal of Astrobiology, that we wouldn't know. All signs really would disappear on a long enough timeline. Okay. And I think it doesn't even have to be as long a timeline as that. And I've brought this up over and over again on Sovryn Tech. Whenever we start talking about, augmented reality, zero UI, okay, or what I call HUI, hands-free UI, because it is HUI. And also, going to thin clients, everything being stored on servers, blah, 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 blah. And, everything being plastic, or you access information through a little device, either a wristwatch, a smartwatch, or your smartphone or something like that. How long would it take? If a civilization got to the point where all of its data and everything that it created, all of its art, all this stuff was just being done digitally, yes, it can just disappear in one fell swoop. I mean, if it's all on one central server or something, and like if the way they interacted with the world was through augmented reality, sure, you'd see no signs of what they had, and maybe they were like, maybe they bought into environmentalism and they're environmentally conscious and they made biodegradable homes and all this shit. I mean, there's a lot of really easy explanations with stuff that exists today that could explain why you see no signs of, an ancient human civilization that could have reached even just our level of technological advancement today. Okay. So that's been my argument for it. And in fact, I've even argued that maybe their technology survived at some points. And this is, like the augmented reality or mixed reality, parts of the technology. And that's where you get all these crazy stories of, magicians making, or whatever, magi, I should say, and all these whatever people, making all these hand motions, and it actually made something happen. And, and that's because the hand motions was just a zero UI, and they had some kind of technology for that. I mean, it's theoretical, but it would explain where you get all these tales of wild creatures. And it's like, well, where are these wild creatures? But they describe them so vividly. It's because they weren't real. They were just mixed reality creations, and they didn't understand that. Okay, so that's part of my argument for why I think it's entirely possible that there was a Civilization X. All right, now, Bloodline of the Gods does not really spend any time describing that, but I wanted you to know where I stand on these ideas and why I research these ideas, because I'm always looking for, when I read these kinds of books, even though, again, right from the get-go, I disagree with their premise that it's aliens. Like right from the beginning. Why do I still read these books? Well, first off, they can actually be genuinely entertaining. I mean, they can be a lot of fun. They can have better storylines than the bulk of science fiction that comes out today, because the bulk of science fiction that comes out today is shit. All right. Fortunately for all of us, we have 100 years worth of science fiction, or actually even more. If you want to go really far back. That we get to read and that most people haven't read, but we get to take it in. I mean, how lucky are we? So anyway, so I read it for entertainment, but also I'm always looking for, okay, what new research, what new little historical oddity did they find that might point at, instead of aliens where they go, but might actually point at Civilization X. That's why I read these books, okay, is because, well, as I say all the time on Sovryn Tech, first and foremost, me, Brian Sovryn, age 37 now. Holy shit. Thank you for all the birthday wishes, by the way. Me, I am first and foremost a gamer. Secondly, I'm a historian. Armchair, but I'm a historian. I was going to go to, I did start going to college for it, but anyway, that didn't work out. And I'm glad that didn't. Number 3, I'm a tech journalist. Okay, so those are where I rank that's how I rank myself. Okay, you understand? So history, very important thing to me. And who knows? Maybe I'm actually working on a book that gives a history of Civilization X, and I'm just trying to put all of this together. Anyway, regardless of that, why don't we start talking about the book? Because I've already been talking 20 minutes. We've barely talked about the book, even though there's not. So again, Nick Redfern, I told you what he's known for. He's an author. He writes for a bunch of different publications. I want to say he's not as crazy as some can be, okay, in the ancient astronaut theorist community. When you see him, and here I think he's British. When you see him and hear him talk on the show, Ancient Aliens, very unique look. He looks like Nosferatu. He looks like a vampire. It's kind of weird. And he has, he kind of has that British, an odd bit of a British accent to him. I'm not saying British accents are odd. They're not. But his comes off as interesting. Granted, I have American ears, so who knows? Anyway, he's not as, credible either as maybe some of the other guys would be. I mean, he's no Sitchin. Von Daniken goes in weird places, but I mean, he's not one of the bigwigs, certainly. But anyway, this book, Bloodline of the Gods. So about Nick Redfern. There's kind of his background. This isn't, like I mentioned earlier, this is a compilation book. Okay. In short, I'll say this: if really it's like a 23 chapter book, only 4 chapters out of those 23 are really worth their salt, are really worth like even reading. Okay. Now I was fortunate. This came out recently in audiobook format. Like I said, it came out in 2015, but an audiobook more recently came out. And actually, speaking of Sitchin, I just noticed that in January, actually so far in 2018, there have been 2 books that have been released from Zecharia Sitchin's Earth Chronicles series. I haven't listened to the audiobook of the 12th Planet yet. And I don't know how well that would work in audiobook form, because Sitchin has a lot of diagrams and a lot of like pictures of, of ancient texts and all that, and tablets. I'm not sure how well it would work in audiobook format, but I am interested to hear that. But you might want to check those out if you're into audiobooks like me. Anyway, I'm very fortunate that because I perused this book in the past. Okay. But it's it's not a long read. It's barely 300 pages. Okay. But it's something where I would have had to invest a lot of time to really sit down and actually read, as to where when I listen to an audiobook, I can knock out an audiobook in a few hours, like sometimes even 2 or 3 hours. In fact, I think I knocked this one out in like 3 hours. Okay. So, I'm glad I listened to it as an audiobook, because if I took the amount of time that it takes for me to actually read with my eyes a book, I would have really felt like it was a waste of time. Like I would have been pissed off. Okay. I'm not saying that the book is necessarily bad. In fact, maybe it's only a waste of time for me. I'll explain why. But anyway, there's 4 chapters. There's like 2 chapters in the beginning and the 2 chapters at the end that hold any interest to me personally. Okay. Again, I'm somebody who doesn't believe in the whole alien aspect of this. Okay, I just think it, whatever it is, may be human or something like that. But this book has an interesting, unique premise to it that I've never read anywhere else. Okay, but all the chapters, the other 19 chapters in between, or 18, whatever. It's a lot of review of, say, Sitchin's theories about the Anunnaki. Okay, which I'm not going to cover here. You can find out about, the theories, the alien theories around the Anunnaki. You can find out about those all over the place. Very, very easy to find out. But basically, the idea is that this planet Nibiru sweeps in every 3,600 years or something, and it's the homeworld of this, group called this alien race that gets the name Anunnaki, and the Anunnaki, alter humanity to be their slave species. Okay, but Nick Redfern that's Sitchin's theory, and he makes an interesting case for it. Okay, and like I said, I don't agree with the alien aspect, but there's a lot of points to it that Sitchin brings up that I think are fascinating and are not explainable away by really by much of anybody, like that they need to be taken notice of. And I've brought up Sitchin many times, and I even started a hashtag that was Sitchin was right because like whenever we're searching for another planet in our solar system and things like this, it all becomes very interesting stuff, some of which Nick Redfern brings up in Bloodline of the Gods. Anyway, so he gets into that, he explains all that away. Maybe I'll do a review of 12th Planet in the near future too. Okay. But anyway, that way I can go deeper into what I think actually, the Anunnaki are, etc. But anyway, Redfern gets into that after the first 2 chapters. This is the middle ground that we're talking about here. Okay. The first 2 chapters is his initial premise, which I will talk about in a second. Then he gets into alien abductions. Betty and Barney Hill, right, in Lancaster, New Hampshire, which is kind of like the first major alien abduction story, at least in the U.S. And then he gets into, what else? Then he gets into reptilians, black-eyed children, okay, and I'm not going to spend any time really talking about all those things. But he spends a lot of time, getting into some of these other more X-Files style stories, okay, throughout it. And that's just really boring to me. Now, thing is that if you are new to, UFOlogy or ancient alien theory and stuff like that, that might all be very interesting to you, because he does a pretty good job of compiling it all. and trying to create, like I say, this grand unified theory of ancient aliens, more or less. I mean, he really does. But to me, that's all old hat. I've been reading that stuff since I was a teenager. I read The 12th Planet when I was a teenager. I mean, I've been reading this stuff forever. Okay. So, it's like, oh, come on. All right. Yeah, let's get past this. I mean, he does it uniquely he brings all of it up to try and prove his initial premise, which has to do with type O negative blood. Okay. So, I mean, he has a point in bringing it up, but it really just feels like a lot of filler. Like I said, really only the first couple chapters, like everything before he gets into the Anunnaki. And then everything after, I think he talks about reptilians, which, give me a fucking break. That's where the interesting things are brought up in this book, and the very unique things. And I have to give him credit. He comes up with a very unique theory, okay? And he explains it pretty well. Like his science at first is really solid, and it's very engrossing. Like, he wrote this book in a very smart way. He doesn't start with the beginning of time. He starts at the beginning of his premise and then kind of, builds out, and then goes back to, the Anunnaki and keeps going up and up and up throughout history, until he ends up, okay, what does this all mean now? So his initial premise, let's talk about this. His initial premise is that you have humans have, however many different blood types, right? You have the four main, you have, O, A, B, and AB, okay? But then within that, you have what? You have O positive, A positive, B positive, AB positive, and then you have O negative, which is the universal donor. Then you have A negative, B negative, and AB negative, right? So you have these blood types. Okay, and he makes a historical case for how important blood is to historically, like how it's long been a concept throughout human history of the importance of blood. And even today, I mean, you could look in Japan, where like dating sites and everything, blood type is a huge thing. They consider it, they almost treat it, it's like an astrology thing, where they treat it as, oh, this explains your attitude, this explains this, blah, blah, blah. And that's been a huge thing in Japan for thousands of years. They didn't know about blood types thousands of years ago. But the abstract idea that your blood was, determined things for you has been around for a good long while in Japan. Okay, whether they knew the exact science of it or not, that's a whole other story. People can get into I Ching and everything. I mean, that's a whole other aspect. So, but just to explain my point, is that yes, cultures have for either hundreds or decades or thousands of years, pick your time frame, blood is considered very important. You can, and Nick Redfern brings this up, rightly, I think, that when you look in the Bible, the Judeo-Christian Bible, blood is an incredibly important part of the story, and it really is. It comes up a lot, and I mean, there's whole laws, made around it and everything. He even, to his credit, he brings up the Noahide laws, which I thought was very... You don't get that talked about much. No, not a lot of people know about the Noahide laws. If you want me to talk about the Noahide laws sometime, of course, understand I'm ethnically Jewish, so I get a lot of, I've heard about a lot of these concepts, but maybe Christians or cultural Christians had never, heard of these sorts of things, like the 7 Noahide laws. Feel free to, ask me about it, and I'd be willing to talk about it. So his premise is around blood, and namely around Rh negative blood, that is in people that are either O negative, A negative, B negative, or AB negative. Okay, that these people, his claim, okay, and this is within those first couple chapters that are very interesting. His claim is that Rh negative blood humans are actually they are the descendants, like the ones today. Okay, they are the descendants of a couple things. One, they are the descendants of Cro-Magnon man, not Homo sapiens sapiens necessarily, but Cro-Magnon. Okay, which Cro-Magnon people, you lose them around 40,000 years ago. You lose Neanderthals around, or 40,000 BC. You lose Neanderthals around 30,000 BC, something like that, right? So Cro-Magnons were a separate type of Homo sapiens. Okay, and they're a very early type, and they're known for a few things. One is they didn't have the sloping brow like Neanderthals. Okay, so they didn't necessarily look funny, not necessarily, but they were very large. On average, their average height was between 6 feet and 7 feet. As to where Homo sapiens sapiens, the average height is more between 5 and 6 feet. Okay, so they're head and shoulders above the Homo sapiens as we know them. And so there's a claim of that they're tall. They're also usually very, the claim is that, based upon the bones and everything that we found of them, the remains that we found of them, is that they're very powerful. They're very strong, broad chests, the whole thing. Okay. They're big people. And also, now this doesn't necessarily mean that they're smarter. And like I always say, the concept of IQ is largely bullshit. Okay. They had a larger brain cavity. They had theoretically larger brains. Okay, and so one could argue if a brain is bigger, does that mean it's smarter? No, not really. Okay, Nick Redfern is making that equation, okay, or, is equating that. But that's not necessarily true, right? Like, a blue whale isn't smarter than, well, as far as we know, isn't smarter than a human. Like I don't think brain size equates to intellect or, into abstract intellectual ability. Okay, I don't think that those two match up. So there's already a problem with what Nick Redfern is kind of claiming, because he's starting off, like I said, with, Cro-Magnon man is this really important thing, this, superior human species. Okay. And as to where, that claim alone, maybe physically, sure, that's, I think, objectively could be shown. And certainly they're superior in that they're, like say physically, they're taller and whatever else and maybe stronger. But as far as being like mentally superior, well, that's a specious claim. But regardless, that's his claim, is that Cro-Magnons were somehow superior. Now, his claim goes further to say that Cro-Magnons were potential. Well, he gets into the Basque people in like the second chapter. We'll talk about that in a second. But basically that, that Cro-Magnons were either the product or that they were used as the template for the Anunnaki to create this worker species of aliens. Now, he gets into a lot of high drama in between all this, that there was, and Sitchin would do this as well, that there were battles, with like civil wars effectively within the Anunnaki themselves. And sometimes there were civil wars between, what do we do with this advanced species, this hybrid species that we created? And he gets into like, this is all stuff that Sitchin has covered before. It's old hat. But the idea, and this is what's interesting. And like I said, folks, I'm not here to give you, like, this isn't necessarily a Cliff Notes version of the book. You really should read it for yourself if you're intrigued by what I'm talking about at all. Again, whether you're like me and you think the whole alien idea is bullshit, or if you do think the alien idea has validity, maybe it's more interesting to you then. And also, this is a great introduction to ancient alien theory, like I said, if you needed an introduction by now. So bottom line being is that, Rh negative people, okay, are actually aliens. They're a hybrid of like a human, an Earth species mixed with a shit ton of alien DNA. Now, one of his arguments for this, amongst others, okay, there's two big arguments that he makes that stand out. One is how if you have Rh, if a mother, okay, if a woman has Rh negative blood, and the male that say that they have intercourse, they're going to have a baby, blah blah blah, okay, that impregnates her has Rh positive blood. Okay, as in he's A positive, B positive, AB positive, O positive, whatever. But she's, either O negative, A negative, etc. That potentially because the mother has that negative, or if one, I think it might even be if one of the partners has a Rh negative blood, that Stephanie could explain this much better, that it can kill the baby. Like pretty much the Rh negatives have the claim that gets made by Nick Redfern is that Nick Redfern is that the Rh negative humans, even though they're not exactly humans, by his claim, is that it can keep Rh positive people from breeding, from their population growing, by killing off a baby that potentially has Rh positive blood instead of Rh negative. So, I mean, and that's true. Like, that's actually very true. I could have Stephanie come down right now, and explain it. And that does happen. Of course, now today with modern medicinal technology, it's not guaranteed anymore that occurs. That the baby would die because of that, because of that mixture between a Rh negative parent and a, Rh positive parent. But it does occur. Now, the other kind of point that he brings up is the Basque people, okay? And the Basque people they're people that, it's a culture and, a genetic heritage of people that live in Basque country, which is this area that's kind of shared with France and Spain historically. The interesting thing about the Basque is that they have, and a lot of this part is true. That's what made this book interesting, is that the first couple chapters, he's laying out some, what's considered largely historical fact, genetic fact, etc. Other than, the alien aspect or the the alteration aspect. But he doesn't get into that exactly. He just starts making his case saying, well, here's what we know about Cro-Magnons, IQ notwithstanding. Here's what we know about Rh negative, or about, blood types and everything and what it can cause when they're intermixed. Here's what we know about, and then he goes into the Basque people, who are this very unique culture. In fact, there's a lot of, first off, they have a high instance, the highest instance in the world, apparently, of Rh negatives, okay, that quote unquote naturally occur. And also, like, their language has no origin point, according to a lot of, linguists, historical linguists. It's not Indo-European. Nobody knows where the hell this language comes from. So, of course, Nick Redfern gets into the idea that, well, that's because their culture and their language and all this is descendant from the aliens who, took Cro-Magnon man. Because then he goes into how the Basque people are really beautiful, blah, blah, blah. He goes into like this whole thing, a lot of which, there's conventional ideas of beauty, but historically those conventional ideas shift, right? So it's a very subjective thing. It's kind of a weird thing to base stuff on, but whatever. He brings the point up, etc. And so he hinges a lot on this idea of the Basque people, that they are the remains of this Cro-Magnon alien / Cro-Magnon experiment. Okay. Now, if I bring up Cro-Magnon man at some point in this and I end up calling them Cro-Mags, don't mind me. I am an old school science fiction guy. I'm a fan of the show Sliders. And if you remember in the 90s science fiction show Sliders, eventually, I think it was when the Sci-Fi Channel picked it up, that they brought on the idea of the Cro-Mags, which were they were like from another dimension, or from an alternate dimension, not another dimension, but an alternate Earth dimension, that where the Cro-Magnon man actually was very advanced, and they are, Cro-Magnons are kind of the enemies of, of the Sliders, okay, in that show, which is interesting because that kind of plays on the idea that, Cro-Mags, maybe they were some kind of superior thing. But anyway, that's science fiction, and that show is, well, that's not everybody's taste. At least certainly the later seasons weren't so much. But if I call them Cro-Mags, that's because in the show Sliders, this is what they called the Cro-Magnons. They called them Cro-Mags. So, okay. So there's the basic idea, is that humans with Rh negative blood are actually a completely separate race, and they are the descendants of this ancient alien worker program. Even though it gets a little more complex than it just being a worker program, but that's the basic idea. Okay. So, according to Nick Redfern, if you have Rh negative blood, as in if you're A negative, B negative, AB negative, or O negative, which it's interesting that the O negatives particular, like he makes a big case about them, partly because, yes, everybody knows they're the universal donors. Okay. But also it's odd that O negatives can only get blood transfusions from other, O negatives, right? They even though their blood works with everybody else, it doesn't work the other way around that way. So he makes a special case about the O negatives, and when he starts going through through history and everything, he's pointing out how much royalty, how many famous people, celebrities and world leaders and all this all have, or not all, but many have Rh negative blood. So that's part of his, that's backing up this idea that the Rh negatives are like this other race, and he's kind of arguing that they're superior. Now, interestingly, he never says whether he's Rh negative or not. He brings up that Eric Von Daniken is Rh negative, and he brings up some other people that are Rh negative. And then he gets into this. This is where we get, so there's your first two chapters that are very interesting where he's making that case. And he more or less says that he thinks in the future, eventually we're going to find out that this is fact, that Rh negatives are actually aliens, and that there's going to be a race war between the Rh negatives and the humans. Okay. He never brings up what he is. He never explains. So I don't know what angle he's coming from. I suppose maybe I can look it up and it would say. But he does mention that Eric Von Daniken is O negative. He does mention some other people that are O negative that are doing research in areas that bolster his point. And this is where he gets into what are perhaps the wilder abilities of Rh negative people. Okay. And I'll describe those in a second because one of them is important, or one of them is kind of interesting. In fact, it's even more interesting as of the day that I'm recording this. So myself, if you're wondering, what blood type am I? Well, I'm O negative. So obviously I'm reading this book and I'm going, well, that's nice. Right? Okay. I'm not only, according to this book, and again, I don't believe it, but according to this book, I am not only an alien, but I'm also in the royalty class, of these aliens. And yeah, I mean, for me, I have certain biases within this, right? So, I'm ethnically Jewish, okay? And even within Judaism, I come from a pretty special class, all right? I come from what's known as Kohanim, okay, which is this really, you can be a Levite, which is the priestly class under Judaism, okay? It's kind of the 13th tribe, as it were. But then even within Levites, there is a upper class within Levites, which are known as the Kohanim, which means you're a direct descendant of Aaron, the brother of Moses. Okay. And I'm a Kohanim. So hearing, reading this, oh, well, you're in the special class of people, and hey, you're even in you're in the upper crust of the special class of people even, it's well, okay, I've been hearing this my whole life already anyway, but so it did kind of tickle some of my biases, right? But I don't misunderstand me. I don't think this is actually a thing. It's interesting. I mean, the case he's making about, what's this deal with O negative people and Cro-Magnons and all that. I mean, well, let's talk about the abilities of the Cro-Magnons, but it is interesting to think about. Okay. But it does get into a real racialism. And I mean, if you could only imagine what a group with the abstract attitude of the Nazis would do with, say, the knowledge that Nick Redfern has, because their claims would be very similar, right? Well, anyway, let's talk about, and that's dangerous. I mean, that's concerning. I mean, you tell people that they're superior, and a lot of them, how do they react? Well, then we need to get rid of the inferior ones and make the world for us, which I don't get it, but I can understand to some degree, in the abstract sense, where people get that idea from. Because, look, the world is made for the average. And when you're above average, once when people realize, people that are actually above average in whatever aspect that happens to be, okay, I'm not making an argument of racialism, and I'm sure as fuck not saying that, I'm empathizing with Nazis or anything like that. Obviously, I'm not. I'm a fucking Jew, okay? But when people come to the realization that that one of the major problems with the world is that it's built for the average, okay? It's not built to bolster the exceptional or even to help the perhaps unexceptional, to help the poor or something like that, but that it's just meant to maintain the status quo, and it's just meant to be the best for the average. Great example, scissors are made for right-handers, right? World's made for the average. Okay. That's one where you get it. There's an economic sense to that. And you could say there's economic sense to all of it. But then, is that really a good thing? That's another argument entirely. Okay. But when people realize that, then, they can get mad about it and they might want to try and do something about it. And it may, end up in violence, which is where I can't agree at all. Okay. So anyway, yeah, I could see where people would want to run with this. I haven't seen any groups yet who are like, well, we're the Rh negatives. We need to do something before the Rh positives do something about us. Okay, let's talk about the abilities. Then I want to talk about why he thinks this race war is coming in the future, because he actually makes a pretty interesting argument for why that is. All right, so the abilities that he claims, and this is where it starts to get into supernaturalism, and I just, again, you lose me. You start talking aliens and the supernatural, and I'm lost. He gets into the idea that Rh negatives have psionic abilities, like certain telepathic abilities, maybe even like almost hypnotic abilities at points. He gets into, what else? He talks about how they're generally like larger, more muscular, and it's easier for them to build muscle, things like this. I mean, obviously, I'm reading that and I'm going, oh, well, because I'm a pretty big guy. But anyway, I'm 6'1" and all that. So that would fit in with his Cro-Magnon narrative and everything. And he talks about how they're generally smarter, significantly smarter, actually, not just generally smarter, but significantly smarter than the rest of the population. I mean, he goes down this whole list of things. Okay, of these greater abilities that Rh negatives have. Again, where do I stand on all this? Yeah, it's interesting, but like whatever. Okay, and me particularly, I should be loving this. I should be like, well, fuck, this is describing me to a T. I'm even, like I said, I'm O negative. I am. I've got this ability, blah, blah, blah. I wouldn't argue that I'm more attractive than people. I'd argue quite the opposite. I'm an ugly motherfucker. Okay, but I've got a face for radio, baby. But regardless, all right, whatever. And so, but then let's talk about what he gets into with the race war and why he thinks that this is going to happen. He makes a very great point that if you found out that, say, the ancient alien theory were true, even though there's a point in the book that where he brings up what actually Sitchin and Von Daniken and a lot of other ancient alien theorists would bring up, that just because ancient aliens made humans doesn't mean that supernaturalism, that there isn't a God, that there isn't an ultimate creator, because he would argue that the Anunnaki seem to believe in an ultimate creator. I would disagree with that, but regardless, we'll keep going. But he said that if you make the claim that aliens made humans what they are, then you would crush, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and a bunch of other religions. And when you crush people's religions, or when you disprove them, or even when you mock them or make fun of them, ugly things can happen and things get violent. Okay, people die. And sure, historically that's true. And even in recent history, Charlie Hebdo, he brings that up. He brings up, a slew of other cases where, and it's not just Muslim cases either. There's Christian cases where it happens, etc. And, one only needs to look at Israel-Palestine and there's issues, right? To say the least. I'm being, that's a very gentle term for me to use. So, people take religion really fucking seriously. And if you try to, if you bring out substantial claims or substantial, being just joculant about it, you could die for that. And so if suddenly it were proven that there were a bunch of O negative people, or, that Rh negatives was this alien race, people aren't going to change their religion. They're going to get rid of the evidence, which that's historically proven that people will do this, Christians or otherwise. They're going to get rid of the evidence that's true. No, they're not going to change their religion. They're going to change you. And if they have to, they're going to off you. Okay. Now, that's not the only point. He has a two-pronged point of why he thinks there's going to be a race war. The other thing he brings up is the Ebola outbreak of 2014. And he has other examples too. I'm just giving you a couple of them, okay? But he makes a very interesting case why he thinks a race war between aliens and humans would actually happen on the planet. And he's talking about, the Ebola outbreak in 2014, where he says, look, he said there was only 4 people in the U.S. that were diagnosed with it. Only 1 of those 4 people died. The other 3 made a full recovery. And he makes all the examples and the cases and quotes and, from papers and everything. I mean, people were clamoring for the city of Dallas, which is one of the areas where, where this is going down, to be quarantined, the whole fucking city. Just on the claim. Again, only 1 person died. And I know Ebola is serious. I mean, no doubt about that. I get it. But how much more serious is it when you find out that there's an alien race among you, right? And he's like, people will go to crazy extremes. He said, and they're either going to, put you in internment camps like the Japanese, or like how FDR wanted to toss the Jews in Oregon. Yeah, Franklin Delano Roosevelt wanted to put the Jews in Oregon. Oh, yeah, he really saved the Jew. My fucking ass. It could get ugly. And his case is a good one. Like, it's a very interesting, and I'm just giving a couple examples. He makes a very interesting case why just the claim alone, could incite wild violence and shifts in how, people that are, just going about their everyday lives, like, say, myself, would get locked away or killed or who knows what. So, and I never, like, this is the thing, because I've read like these horrendous books like White Power by George Lincoln Rockwell, a lot of this American Nazi shit and everything, where they're always saying, oh yeah, we're just a step away from a race war and all that. And their arguments are always so much bullshit. Like, they're always so much crap. But he did, when they say that there's going to be a race war between the blacks and the whites, or, whatever it ends up being. But the kind of the case that he makes, he has pretty good evidence for why he thinks that this would happen when it's something that extreme, where no, it's not even that we're all human, because that's a narrative a lot of people accept today, thankfully. Guess what? According to Nick Redfern, we're not all human. And then you're going to run into a whole other issue, and so it's an interesting claim that he makes, and an interesting case that he makes with all that. Beyond that, the RH negative stuff, this is the problem, is that the middle of the book is just a lot of rehash, and I think a lot of very questionable claims over abductions and all that. And the reason he brings up the abductions is he's saying, well, it's because, the people that were abducted had RH negative blood, blah, blah, blah. So, he has a reason for bringing it up. But it feels like a lot of filler and a lot of rehash with his own little personal spin on it. And I'm not saying that's not important or that it's not valid to be in the book, but for me, it was boring stuff. All I really wanted was like the first couple chapters and then the last couple chapters to make his case. And those 4 chapters are very interesting. I don't agree with them, but they're very interesting in the case that they're making. And he does a pretty good job. Nick Redfern's obviously not a stupid person. Okay, at least not entirely. So, yeah, if you want to check out this book, you can read it and get into all of that. Why don't I think that this is true is that there's not enough evidence, that RH negatives are some kind of, well, first off, I don't think there's any evidence that aliens have been to Earth. Okay, so that part of it, that initial part of the premise is already problematic. Okay, but the idea that somehow RH negatives are some kind of special version of humans, I'm not necessarily like opposed to that concept, but also I need a lot more. Okay. And like I'd even, especially if you're making like this idea that they're advanced or genetically altered, well, then you got to prove a civilization X to me before I go walking around, making this claims that I'm something special. Right. Okay. So it's interesting, and it's one of the, I'll give it this. It's one of the better Ancient Alien books, and one of the more original, at least with the first 4, or with those 4 chapters that I mentioned, the first 2 and the last 2. It's one of the more original ones that I've read in a long, long while. Also, I do want to give him credit, like with the abduction theories and everything else that he talks about, he does make this book pretty sexy, meaning that he uses a lot of the and obviously because we're talking about procreation and propagation of, say, the RH negative species, he keeps it pretty sexual. Like, he gets into a lot of sexuality and sexual encounters and everything, even though some of that could be rapey. He gets into all of that in this. And so like that makes it a little more engaging, right? Because we're talking about sex. And of course that piques up everybody's ears, whether they hate it or they don't, or they love it. There's a point where he starts talking about reptilians. I want to address this for a minute. And he makes it very clear. He's like, hey, a lot of these claims are crazy about reptilians. He tries to go middle of the road with reptilians. He says, but then there's some where it's like, well, what the hell is that? And I get some of the cases that get brought up about reptilians. Okay, first off, like I don't, because this is one of the first conspiracy theories I ever encountered, and I encountered it as a teenager. I've told the story before on this show, as well as on actually when I was on School Sucks with Brett. I've talked about it. I mean, the claims that Jews are lizards. Just stop. I have fun with it. I joke about it. Okay, that I'm a lizard and all that stuff. I'm not. All right. Of course, that's exactly what a lizard, Rh negative lizard would say, right? That's part of the royal O negative class. Give me a break. But it's so crazy. Anyway, he gets into some of that, and like he gives a couple of specific cases where people are having sex with the reptilians. In fact, there's this one woman that he talks about in it where she is a musician and she wrote an entire album about her love affairs with this reptilian, and she's being dead serious. But a lot of the abduction cases that he brings up and everything, I mean, I think, as far as my take on the whole UFO abduction, alien abduction stuff, and it's not a unique take on my part, I really do think, okay, first off, I'm not opposed to all right, what do I think about UFOs? I guess I should explain that quickly, okay? I think UFOs, some of them are legitimate, but they're not alien. They are government projects. I absolutely believe that. No, I don't think, I know what's at Area 51. I've talked about it on Patreon episodes, okay? Well, I don't want to say I know. I mean, I know it's been there, okay? But I'm telling you, there's not aliens at Area 51. Let's make that clear. Okay, I do think that there are a lot of advanced technologies that the U.S. government, and maybe in conjunction with other governments, has developed, and that they have tested in the skies above various parts of the U.S. and the world. I'm very open to that. Okay, I mean, I'm open to other explanations as well, but they are all human explanations, not aliens. There's not somebody coming from Alpha Draconis or Sigma Draconis or whatever. There's not people coming from Sirius B. There's not people coming from Proxima Centauri, whatever. Okay, there's not Proxima B, right? There's not aliens coming from other worlds or whatever. That's not what what UFOs are. A lot of them are fake. You can prove it, but then there's others that it's not so easy to disprove them. Okay, but I think that it's I'm kind of going Occam's razor on it, but I think it's just they're government, it's government experiments. That's all that it is. And I think that can be, a lot of it can be so, like even with what was done to the humans, that those could be, to the people that claim to be abductees, it could be some kind of government experiment. I have no problem, believing or finding out I have a problem with it, but I have no problem with believing that that's what they are. But it seems pretty clear, especially when some of the cases that Nick Redfern brings up as far as abductions go, or like sleeping with reptilians, when it's happening to women that are like 12 years old, or, and then it keeps happening over and over again, blah, blah, blah. Like, I really think that's, people are having psychotic breaks and they were raped as children. And it's really sad. And I think that's true for a lot of alien abduction cases. And it's very tragic. And, if you encounter somebody, because I have, if you talk to people who make that claim, if they claim that they're abducted or they've been abducted over and over again and they've had sex with aliens, believe me, I've talked to these people. Ask them, like the first question to ask, and usually they want to tell you, they want to talk about it. Ask them when it happened at first. And if they say it happened to them when they were like a teenager or even in their 20s, just try to be really empathetic with them. Okay. Don't, it's a tough conversation to have, because when I hear that, that's just instantly what comes to my mind. And sometimes it's pretty understandable, because conventionally these could be beautiful women that this happens to, and you could understand why that, not understand why, you could see why it happened. You don't want to understand it, because fuck those people that do anything to ever harm a child. But, just be empathetic with them. Don't make fun of them, because they're obviously already having issues with their traumas. Okay. And that's where I really think that comes from. And Nick Redfern really should have brought up that possibility that that's what's going on, instead of trying to take it so seriously or use it to bolster his book. I think that's pretty bad form on his part. So the abduction stuff, I think, is pretty much meaningless. He could have gotten away with explaining. He wouldn't have had as large a book as he did, but he could have gotten away with explaining a lot of what was going on, or a lot of his initial premise, without going there. But he goes there. What are we going to do? It would have been interesting if he had an alternative theory to bring that up. He didn't necessarily try to disprove. Great science, you always want to falsify your claims. Some of it he tries to falsify, like some of the initial stuff. But once he gets into the Anunnaki and the abductions and everything, he stops trying to falsify. And I think he should have continued to try to falsify, maybe reference Civilization X. What if this is like an ancient human thing? Maybe do stuff like that, and he just wouldn't go there. Maybe that doesn't sell as many books. I could believe that. Okay, and he was just, looking to make a buck. I can understand that too. But yeah, that's where the book comes in at a weak point. Like I said, the entire middle of this book is pretty weak and kind of meaningless. But the first 2 chapters and the last 2 chapters are dynamite. I mean, it's really thought-provoking stuff, and it's not enough, but it's thought-provoking, and it makes you wonder and it makes you think, about all of that. Because I mean, I don't put any, I'm not like the Japanese. I mean, I've been to Japan many times. I have tremendous respect for their culture, as I do, just about any culture, just about. And, I know how seriously they take blood. I don't take it that kind of seriously, but I mean, it does, there are questions to be asked of how, why did these, why did O negative, evolve to the degree that it did, et cetera. I mean, like there's really fascinating stuff there. Okay. So, something else I didn't mention, or that I said I was going to mention, and I didn't get to, and I want to get to it very, very quickly. Okay. Nick Redfern, when he's talking about the abilities of the Rh negatives, he gets into this idea of genetic memory, which you might, if you're a science fiction fan, you might remember that term used in Stargate SG-1 to describe the Goa'uld, okay, which the larval Goa'uld that kind of look like snails, which is interesting, okay, and you'll hear why. So he gets into genetic memory, and the idea is that like guys like Eric von Daniken, who have done so much to purport and push the ancient, astronaut theory, ancient alien theory, and all that, his claim is that why von Daniken is so good at actually finding all these places around the Earth and like figuring all this stuff out is because he's just remembering it. Like he has some genetic memory from his Rh negative alien ancestors. Okay. That's passed down to him, and he's just like rediscovering it as he goes along. And now at first blush, like the concept of genetic memory would seem to be nuts, right? The idea that just because of your blood, just because of your genes, okay, that you can remember things from the past. Well, here's something interesting that might point in the direction that I mean, I don't think Eric von Daniken is remembering shit from the past. Okay, I don't. Me personally, in my own experience, I've had moments where I feel like I know something that I never learned, and that there's really no good reason that I should have known, or that I figured out, or that I knew ahead of time, and that, later on would somehow be proven right, scientifically, logically, whatever. Okay. I've had those moments where I felt that, but I'm not going to tack on that somehow I have genetic memory or anything like that. I chalk it up to fortuitousness, nothing more. Okay. But the idea of genetic memory got a little bolstered this week, and we're here at the beginning of May or middle of May 2018, and there was research done that pointed it was done on snails, of all things. Kind of look like the Goa'uld, right? But at the University of California in LA, and this was published in eNeuro, which is a paper, there was research done that showed that if you transferred, so what the scientists did was what the researchers did is they shocked the tail of these snails, okay, of a series of snails. They then, and I forget what the exact number of them were, but this is a pretty straightforward experiment. And then they pulled the RNA, okay, or they pulled some RNA from the snails that were shocked. They then injected the RNA into snails that were not shocked. Okay. And they did this, where they also did the reverse, where there were snails that weren't shocked. They pulled RNA and then put it into snails that equally were, new snails that weren't shocked. So they put it into the new group of snails, and the ones that had the RNA put in them that were from the snails that were originally shocked, they their tail, they scrunched their tails in for a significant amount of time as if they were injured. as to where the ones that the snails in the second group that were injected with RNA from the snails from the first group that weren't, that their tails were not shocked, did not, scrunch in their tails for the significant amount of time that the shocked second group, or, the second group with the shocked RNA did. And so it's pointing at a theory that memory was transferred through RNA with these snails. Now, it's just done on snails. This, if memory is somehow, which this has been talked about for a while, that memory is an RNA. In fact, if people remember one of my favorite movies, actually, but it's a television movie, but one of my favorite movies, Knight Rider 2000, there was this process where you could read the RNA on a person that was recently killed or that was injured, and you could see what happened to them, etc. So this idea has been theorized for a while, but actually it's more than just, I'm being very basic in it, because it's not just the RNA. It's actually, some of the synthesis when it happens where that is being stored, but it's transferable with RNA. Maybe we'll talk about it on a future Sovryn Tech or on a Sex and Science Hour or something. Because Stephanie, I'm sure, would break it down in a much better way than I can. But anyway, the bottom line being is that it would appear there's a hint here that memory can be transferred genetically, or not genetic, but through transferring RNA. Now, is that something? Does that point at there's this ability to pass stuff down to from one generation to the next? It points in the direction that it's possible that memories are at the very least transferable biologically. Okay, according to these snails, if that's true. There's still a ton of research that has to be done on this, but it's interesting that this comes up, and because the genetic memory part was the part where Stephanie and I really laughed, but then she sends me the story this morning and we go, ooh, wait a minute. So it's funny, but that's something else too, is that, the argument goes is that these aliens, because their other traits is that they have this really hard drive to get back, or to get to outer space. And the argument is that they're trying to get back home, because they are part alien. And that there's other aspects. There's a whole laundry list that Nick Redfern goes down of these different traits that Rh negatives have. Now, obviously, and that's another thing where I heard it's they have this really crazy drive, this inexplicable drive to get to outer space. Yeah, I have that all the way. How many times do you have to hear me talk about outer space on Sovryn Tech that you don't know? I really have that. So a lot of those things, I'm reading it, I'm going, wow, that kind of fits a bill with me, a lot of the different aspects that they brought up. Of course, I don't believe that telepathy is actually a thing today. So, that obviously, like I said, I'm not agreeing with this guy, but point being, it's interesting. And that little bit with the snails, I thought that was pretty interesting too, actually, maybe that's not such a crazy idea. But that's a huge leap to go from, we can transfer RNA and snails' tails do a funny thing, to saying, there's people that have genetic memory, right? That's passed down through their genes. No. Okay. Yeah, that claim isn't even ready to really to be backed up or made. All right. So anyway, so Bloodline of the Gods, again, the book's about 3 years old now. There haven't been any updated editions or anything like that. Nick Redfern has other works that are a little more journalistic, not so much scientific as far as this goes. Again, he's not the craziest of the bunch, and I really do appreciate, I think there's points where he was disrespectful, particularly with a lot of abductee or quote unquote abduction victims, quote unquote. Okay, I put that in quotes because I don't think there's aliens, and I don't think a lot of these people were abducted. There's points where he's disrespectful, but then I also appreciate that he's very respectful towards Sitchin's work, which doesn't get enough respect even within the ancient alien community, because I think some of Sitchin's work is so brilliant. It is so on point. And again, I don't believe, I don't agree with aliens, but I think that there's a lot to take from that, that people ignore. So I give Nick Redfern a little bit of credit for that, and for coming up with an original, I think it's a fairly original idea, or at least one that I hadn't seen or heard anywhere else. And I read a lot of these kinds of books, these alternative archaeology, alternative history style books, that are supposedly nonfiction, supposedly. So yeah, Bloodline of the Gods, check it out. If I were to give it a rating, those four chapters, I'd give them 5 stars. The last two the first two and the last two, I'd give those 5 stars. The middle stuff, I'd give like 2 or 3. You know, like no way, I wouldn't give it 2. I'd give it 2, or I wouldn't give it 3. I'd give it 2. So overall average, maybe it's a 3-star book. I don't know if I'm going to do stars. There you go. There's kind of my Amazon review, I guess. And the narration is like, it's a British guy. If you listen to the audiobook, it's a British guy, and it's interesting narration. Very listenable. And, you know, if you're like me and you can listen at like 2.0 or 2.3 or 2.5x, you know, I think it's worth digging into, even though it's only a 3, because like those initial chapters are very interesting. And if you've never, I mean, again, this book actually would probably be a 4 or 5 if you've never heard like Sitchin's theories, or you've never heard a lot of these different abduction stories, or like been introduced to the ideas of like black-eyed children. And I'm not even going to get into that, and reptilians, because I think that's just nonsense. But if you've never heard any of these things, well, all that can get very interesting, you know, when you listen to the book. But yeah, those 4 chapters are totally worth the price, I think, because it's really original, very unique stuff. So anyway, there's my review of Bloodline of the Gods. I hope you found it interesting. If you want more of this kind of content, give me a heart on Patreon for this, or, you know, type underneath the post and let me know that this is the kind of thing, you know, you're interested in a lot more of these. I am definitely going to do a review of Order of Time. I still have to do a review of the Mana Machine, and I'll probably do a review of Chaos. A couple of James Gleek books I might actually do a review of. So we'll get into that. Actually, you know, it'd be awesome if I could do a review of Order of Time with Ellen. That would be really fascinating. I'll talk to her about it, and we'll make that happen. So anyway, that's it for this little bit of Patreon content. Of course, your Wednesday Q&A is coming out, and your live Hangout Q&A, I think, is actually going to be this Sunday. But look out for the official post for that. Let's see, this Sunday would be... That would be the 20th? Holy shit. May's almost over. Okay, so maybe the 20th. That'll be, you know, when we do our live Hangout Q&A. And got some other fun stuff happening this week. You've got your Star Trek update to come out. You got your Star Wars update to come out that we do with Robin. That's going to be awesome. Just lots of great times, and other really cool content. Some tech content actually to come out here very soon. Anyway, all right, that's it for this episode. I will see all of you on the other side. Woo! And remember, it's not aliens. No, fucking really, it's not. All right, other side. Yeah, here we go.